So what we're really trying to do here, just to sort of start again and so forth, is that we have feelings of what's right and wrong. I'm using the word feelings very broadly, but we have a sense of what's right and wrong. And if we have a sense of what's right and wrong, how does that connect to Torah? Because Torah tells us from outside of us what's right and wrong. So one theory is get rid of your feelings. Those senses are irrelevant. It's one possibility. Fact is that Torah seems to imply that the senses do have a value. Another viewpoint is once the Torah tells you what's right and wrong, you're supposed to take those senses and apply it. But we have a distinction between the mitzvah sichlios and the chukim. We have certain mitzvahs we're not supposed to develop that feeling for. Certain mitzvahs we are supposed to develop that feeling for. So it seems to say that this feeling that we have has a role in our moral decision making. And the question is, how do we understand that role? Okay, so right now we're going to get into Chilul Hashem. That's what we're going to look at here, okay? So, and I've developed different sources that seem to imply that there's a value in the evaluation of people. It's really what you're going to do. That feeling, that sense of right and wrong, that is supposed to be a factor in our decision making as Jews. And the most extreme of that is even people who are not Jewish, people totally outside the system, they have a sense of right and wrong that we're supposed to somehow acknowledge and incorporate in us, right into our Torah system of analysis. And the question is how do we do it and what's the validity and so forth. Okay? And one of the ways is we're supposed to be concerned for Chilul Hashem. So, the first thing we have to ask is what exactly is a Chilul Hashem? Okay, and what I want to get into tonight is the concept of Chilul Hashem, and specifically an article that I wrote about this a few years ago. Anyways, but let's talk, what is a Chilul Hashem? Okay, how would you define a Chilul Hashem? Translated as profaning the name of God.
Actions that appear counter to a divine way of living, or to a normative way of living.
And how do you define a divine way of living?
Well, it's probably relative to what you would expect from a person, depending on what their particular background is. You would probably, the non-Jew would distinguish between a camel driver and their expectations of their moral and other deportment from someone who appears to be a pious Jew by
but the question is
a cleric by the way they're dressed.
And what's the yardstick that they're using to evaluate that? The real question is that what's the yardstick that the person is using? We say Chilul Hashem is profaning the name of God. Somehow we're doing something that will cause God's name to be profaned. Not we, that someone is doing something that causes God's name to be profaned, which means there's a evaluation by another person that this person's behavior is profaning the name of God. The question is how does that evaluation happen? What exactly is the evaluation yardstick? What exactly is that response that the person's profaning the name of God?
Isn't it behavior that is inconsistent with the viewer's understanding of how a Jew should behave?
Okay, so what you're saying is, if you're going to your definition, it's the viewer's understanding of how a Jew should behave, and how does that viewer get to that evaluation? What yardstick is the viewer using to come to how a Jew should behave?
I think that's essentially the problem, is that the viewer may very well be incorrect and may lack the proper knowledge to evaluate it, but it doesn't change the issue in a sense. a large portion of what Marasayan is about just that.
Well, is Chil Hashem Marasayan? So you brought up an interesting question of what exactly is Marasayan. You see, what occurs at Marasayan, and that concept of Marasayan, is you're doing something that will be perceived as negative. But really what you're doing is not negative. What's happening in Marasayan? Well, there are two faults in Marasayan. One is a person will see you doing something and get the impression that that behavior is okay, and then will take that impression and apply it to another case which really does make it okay. Now, let's take an example. You have a cheese veggie burger, where the veggie burger looks just like a hamburger, okay? And you're eating there the cheese veggie burger, okay? Okay. So what happens if someone sees you eating the cheese veggie burger? So one of two things a person can happen. A person can come by and say, "Gee, this guy, he's religious. He's eating the cheese veggie burger. Must be okay." I mean, he's eating the cheeseburger. It must be okay to eat cheeseburgers. Fine. That's one problem. There's another problem where the guy will see you eating a cheese veggie burger, think you're eating a cheeseburger, and said, "See, so and so, he doesn't keep Torah because he's eating a cheeseburger."
No, that's not the issue.
That's not the issue with Chil Hashem. That's the issue. That doesn't seem to be the issue with Chil Hashem. That seems to be the issue with Marasayan. That's what Marasayan is something different.
The extension of that, when it becomes Chil Hashem, is when he sees a person, a beard, tzitzit, kippah, and he's sitting down and eating a cheeseburger. He perceives a cheeseburger, and he understands that pious Jews, don't eat dairy and meat together. He's saying to himself, what hypocrites they are. And that they don't have a value of the law they profess to have.
Yeah.
And that's when it becomes, I think,
you've presented an idea where what you're saying is you're giving the impression that you are not loyal to the Torah.
Yeah.
That seems to be what you're saying, right? In other words, according to your understanding of Chil Hashem,
you don't respect God's law.
Which means that it's not a moral perspective. It's not that the non-Jew sees it and says, "Look at these guys, they're acting, I think they're acting immorally." It's, look at these guys, they're not keeping their own law. God told them, or they believe God told them to do A, and they don't even do A. But the point is, an example from the cheeseburger is not a moral perception. It's the fact that the person themselves eats cheeseburgers, doesn't have any negative feelings about cheeseburgers. So that's your understanding of Chil Hashem. Okay?
No, with all due respect, I said that's one of the situations where, because of the person's inability to evaluate, you can actually be doing something correctly. And it can be perceived as a hypocritical act.
Right.
Somebody who doesn't respect the law he professes to respect.
Okay.
That's not the limit of Chil Hashem.
Okay.
That's a small element.
Okay, but what you're doing, what you're getting to in terms of the issue of Chil Hashem is it a Chil Hashem for someone to eat a cheeseburger? Just like that. Someone just eats a cheeseburger. Is it a Chil Hashem? The fact is, it's prohibited for the person to eat a cheeseburger anyways. So the point is, he's already breaking the law. Is every breaking of the law a Chil Hashem?
No.
Okay. Is the breaking of law? Can the breaking of law be a Chil Hashem?
Yes.
In what case?
I think it depends on who's seeing it and how they're perceiving it.
Okay. So what you're saying is if you violate a law publicly, the person, since people perceive you as not being loyal to the law, it's a possibility of a Chil Hashem.
I think it's where it changes from being a Marasayan into possibly a Chil Hashem is the mental process of the viewer that is extrapolating it, that is projecting it from the singular act they're seeing into a generalized approach, a generalized, falsely understood, but a generalization of that means that therefore all Jews behave this way, or the whole religion falls apart because of one practitioner.
But if you're walking on the street in a city that has no Erev,
Mm-hmm.
and you take your glasses off and put them in your pocket,
Mm-hmm.
right? The odds are that nobody who is not a firm Jew, and many firm Jews, are not going to be aware that, oh, he's carrying and it's a violation of the law. That's very different than everybody has an understanding, or a large portion of the population, Jewish and non-Jewish, have an understanding that we don't eat meat and milk together. So it's not any violation. It's a kind of a gross violation.
Okay. See, what you're getting at is this. You see, Maris Hayin is an incorrect statement about the law. A person will see you doing something and either learn that it's okay to do it, okay, in other words, or will have the assumption that you're breaking the law, okay? In other words, it's not a chilul Hashem. The person is basically saying, hey, they'll get the wrong message. They'll think it's okay to eat a cheeseburger when you're eating a cheese veggie burger, or they'll say, look at him, he's not kosher. People walk away and say, Chaim Yankel there is not really kosher because I saw him eating a cheeseburger. That's Maris Hayin. Chilul Hashem gets into a statement where you have a further repercussion, and the way you define that further repercussion is allegiance to God's law, not a moral perception itself. It's a fact that it's an allegiance to God's law. Okay. Now the truth is that in the starting point of Chilul Hashem, that's where it really starts. Because if you look at the Rambam will point out that you see. Look at the Rambam, page 61 here. This handout here, right? Okay? Now, it says, by this prohibition we are forbidden to profane the name of God, so forth. Look at the second paragraph. This sin embraces actions of three kinds. I'm looking at the Rambam, page 61, right? The sin embraces actions of three kinds. Okay? Of which two are possible for anybody, and third only for certain individuals. The first kind of action, let me point out something. The way usually people think of Chilul Hashem, they usually think of non-Jews. The truth is, the starting point is going to be how Jews will look at you, profaning God's name in front of other Jews. Okay, let's go with this. The first kind of action which is possible for anybody is this. Anyone who in a time of persecution is required to transgress one of the commandments, whether his kosher has in mind to make him commit a lesser or a graver sin, or anyone who is required even at a time when there is no persecution commit the sin of idolatry or incest or bloodshed, must sacrifice his life and submit to death rather than transgress, as we explained in connection to the ninth positive commandment, which is the commandment of Kiddush Hashem. Now let me try and explain what he's saying over here. The Rambam is talking like this. You are being forced to violate a law. Okay? If you are being forced to violate a law, someone comes up to you and puts a gun to your head and says, do this or I'll kill you, what are you supposed to do? So the classic statement is, we all know, is that there are three categories of mitzvot that we are to sacrifice our life for rather than transgress, right? Gilui Arayos, the major sexual prohibitions, Sheichus Damin, murder, and Avodah Zarah, in idolatry. That we're supposed to translate, and we have to give up our lives rather than transgress them. However, if we're in a situation of someone saying, eat this ham sandwich, or okay, then you say, there's a concept of chai b'hem, that you should live by them, and the question is you should do the transgression rather than allow yourself to die. Now, there actually are some shittas that hold that if you want to be machmir and allow yourself to die, there are some shittas. Most people hold that you don't have that choice, that you have an obligation to eat the ham sandwich and not die. Okay, the Rambam is opening up is a major distinction. in the time of Shmad, okay, when he wishes to do this in the time of persecution, and the Rambam will go on to explain the certain categories of that persecution, then any violation of the law is not allowed. Okay, the statement of concerning murder, idolatry, and the major sexual prohibitions is even not in the time of persecution, and even without any other of the what do you call it, factors that tell you to give up your life even for a minor transgression, and we'll get to that in a second. So he says like this. So he says, if there's someone, he said, now let's take the case of someone says, bow down to this idol or I'll kill you. Okay, even in private. Okay, if a person commits a sin, if we continue with the Rambam, if he commits a sin and so escapes death, he profanes the name and infringes this negative commandment. Okay? Right? Now, the truth is that he actually doesn't commit the specific sin. In other words, if he's committing idolatry, he's bowing down to an idol, he's violating Chilul Hashem, he's Mechal Shem Shemaim, but he is not considered to be someone who has transgressed the laws of idolatry. Because vis-a-vis idolatry, he was an honest, he was under duress. But there's another law that says he has to do this. Now let's just go on with this. Okay? If it happens in public in the presence of 10 Israelites, he profanes the name publicly and sins against his words. You shall not profane my holy name, and his iniquity is very grievous. Okay, but he is not punished by whipping because he acted under compulsion. Okay, he's not punished for the idolatry. And the court has no right to inflict the punishment of whipping or death except on one who has sinned intentionally of his own free will, before witnesses and defiance of a formal warning. So Chilul Hashem, it's a unique thing. It's not punished by the courts. Okay? Now, in this situation, the reason he brings up the issue of publicly is that in times of Shmad, where there's persecution, there's a whole variety of different opinions. There's times where what is the motivation of the person who wants to coerce you? And there's different viewpoints. There's a lot of factors involved. What's the motivation of the person who wishes to coerce you? Okay, a guy comes over to a woman and says, married woman, and says, if you don't sleep with me, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to kill your husband, or something like that. I'm going to kill you, right? Okay. How do you define that? He's not motivating because he's trying to attack the religion. He's motivated by his own lust. How much of a factor is it lust or versus an attack upon the religion? In other words, he wants to make you eat a ham sandwiches to defy your religion, or he has some other reason why he's getting a kick out of you eating ham sandwiches. That's a factor that's involved. The question is, how many people is it done in front of? 10 Jews or not 10 Jews? That's a factor. The truth is that if a person is doing it in order to attack the religion, telling you eat the ham sandwich to show that you defy God, and you are to do that, and he wants you to do that in front of 10 Jews in time of persecution, then you have to give up your life for any transgression. Okay? Those are the factors. His motivation is to attack the religion. He wants it done publicly in front of 10 Jews. The other extreme is by Shvichas Dam and Gilui Arayos and Avodah Zarah, where even in private, and the person is being motivated by his own or her own lust, right? You have to give up your life. And in between, there's different viewpoints. If it's in public, if it's not time of Shema, something like that, there's all different viewpoints in this. But the Rambam is getting to that point. But the key point over here is it's to show defiance of the religion, and the public nature of it, if it's a public nature, is in front of 10 Jews. Okay? That's the first one.
Is that because of the demoralization of the other 10 Jews seeing this? I mean, because otherwise, public is public.
it's
how many, and got to be something.
it seems to be the factor is it challenges your loyalty to God, and what's significant is not challenging your loyalty to God in front of 10 Jews. That seems
In time of trouble.
In time of trouble, right.
I'm not sure if this is the most relevant, but I have sometimes wondered if I were forced or persuaded to do something, and let's say I would get $1 million, $10 million, whatever it is, and I, in my own mind, it would go, say, for Jewish education, so forth. Now, look, if I sacrifice myself, I'm, in the total scheme of things, as far as I'm concerned, close to a relative nobody or very close to that. In some ways, by doing this, let's say, sin, there could be a distinct payoff down the road for others. In my mind, that is sometimes seen potentially worthwhile. I'm not sure exactly how I hit upon this notion. What made me think about something, what triggered it, but the idea that if I were to do something wrong, and I couldn't readily envision great repercussions, I don't know, being such a bad example and so forth, maybe I could do a lot of good with my $10 million or whatever it was.
You're entering into the question of the concept that's called Avera Lishma, okay, a sin for the sake of heaven. And that's a very, very big topic. And it is somewhat of a problematic topic. There seems to be issues of making decisions, and sometimes you have concepts where a prophet can make such a decision, a chazal can make such a decision, where by definition a prophet is doing under a prophet can, like the case of Eliyahu at Har Carmel, that he wanted to show this great the great sanctification of God's name there, but the truth is you were not allowed to sacrifice outside of the temple, but that was a special thing where prophets can do certain things in contrary to the law in very specific situations. That's the one I was going to get to. The big question is Esther. Esther is a classic situation where Esther basically saves the Jewish people by fundamentally going in to sleep with Ahasuerus. Now, the truth is, a lot of commentators in that Esther didn't actually initiate any physical contact and so forth, but there's a whole variety of different issues with this. But the point is, it's a question of verily Shema. There's no doubt that there's actually a big machlokas where the verily Shema applies only to non-Jews or also applies to Jews. Or some people say concept of verily Shema only applies to non-Jews. And that's learned from, what's her name? Yael, thank you, who killed Sisera, right? She was a married woman. She basically seduced Sisera, got him to go to sleep after seducing him, and then cut off his head. And the point is, she was able to do this because she was a non-Jew. People say Verily Shema is clearly okay for non-Jews. It gets into that analysis of how much analysis do we have to make decisions in terms of a policy decision that says, hey, listen, I'm going to do this one bad thing, but it's going to have tremendous positive repercussions. The classic argument against that is very simple in the sense that God can do anything He wants. So the point is you think you're going to do this, don't worry, maybe it would be better if you didn't take your own cheshbon, your own analysis, and just did what God told you. But it's a little bit of an issue. But we're not going to get to that issue. We're dealing with the simple case of Chil Hashem. So the simple first definition of Chil Hashem over here, okay, is you're doing something that gives the impression that God, that you don't care what God says. That's the first thing, which is what you said. Now let's look at the second kind of action. Also possible for anybody is committing a transgression which, though not caused by lust or the desire for gain, shows indifference and laxity of behavior. Okay? Okay, in this case, it's the reason why you're doing the Avera. Okay? In other words, even if you just do the Avera. But if you're a person who does an Avera because you're motivated by lust, okay, so you're lustful. But if you're an individual who says, I'm going to eat this ham sandwich to show what I think of God, right, even if no one's forcing you to do it, that's considered to be a Chilul Hashem. Again, because you were showing indifference to God. Okay? So this says,
regardless of who's present?
Right. That's basically called Lahachis, doing a very Lahachis, which is basically to attack God, to challenge God. That's also considered to be a Chilul Hashem. Okay? Okay, now the question is, what you're saying is that you're saying is this done in front of other people? You can chal shame even by yourself, by the very action being that you're making a statement against God. Now the third one is a very interesting one. Now this is the third one the Rambam says, but then this is not going to be the one that's colloquial understood to be chal shem, but it already opens up the question. Because the other ones is that the problem is it shows a lack of loyalty to God. Now let's look at this third case. The third kind of action, possible only for certain individuals, is conduct by a man of known piety and righteousness, which seems to the populace to be a transgression, and to be unworthy of such a pious man, though it is in fact permitted. Such conduct also is profanation of the name according to the sages, who say, what constitutes profanation of the name? If, for instance, I take money from the butcher and do not pay him at once. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan says, in my case, it's profanation if I walk four cubits for amot, right, without uttering words of Torah, or wearing my tefillin, things of that nature. Now, what's happening over here is, it's not halachic. It's a perception that the masses come to a certain conclusion, a certain perception of what they expect from an individual who is pious or whatever, and you are not meeting their standard. Now, the fact is how do they get their standard? So either it's a misunderstanding of the halacha, but for some reason it's something they expect you to do, right? Even though it's really permitted. Okay, but the key word over here is that they think it's unworthy of such a pious man. In some way, there's an indication that this behavior, it's not just simply those masses will make the mistake that you're not being loyal to God, so you better do this because these guys are idiots and will come to an incorrect conclusion about you. There seems to be an idea that this is proper for behavior for you, and that the masses perceive this to be proper behavior is something that is correct. Even though it's halachically permitted, the development of ideas beyond the simple reading of the halacha is considered to be correct. In other words, in these cases over there, so Rabbi says, if I'm not saying Torah, even though I might have a reason not to say Torah, if the masses will look at me and say, gee, he walks in the street without his tefillin or something like that, in those days when we used to wear tefillin all the time, then there's an idea that someone so great should not be like that. That conclusion, that perception is given to be a value that actually has value. That perception has value. It's not just simply, hey, you look like you're not being loyal. Well, those people are totally off, but we gotta be concerned about those people, okay, for whatever reason. Even though amongst ourselves we can talk about them and say, gee, all these guys are really ignoramuses. They think it's wrong for me to do this, but what can I do? I gotta act this way. Okay, so you gotta act them. Or is it the fact that their perception of what they expect of you is somewhat legitimate? Which means
somewhat, as opposed to that you really have to follow their perception.
Well, that's the whole issue. It seems to be that on some level, some of their perceptions, if you don't follow their level, it's a chilul Hashem. In other words, that further value or further yardstick which they are imposing upon you has some validity. For you not keeping their standard, there's something wrong with that. Okay? Even though it's halachically permitted. There's something about it that says that the development in the masses has validity. But in this level, what the Rambam is still talking about is somehow they make conclusions based upon halacha. See, they look at these things, and if you look at this third category, and the Rambam says it's specifically by a great person, okay, the person is known of known piety and righteousness, which seems to the populace to be a transgression, to be unworthy of such a pious man. They have their understanding of Torah, and then they build edifices upon their understanding of Torah. And somehow we are to consider the edifices that they build. Does that mean everything that they build? Or does that mean something that they build? But somehow what they build upon the Torah has validity. Okay, that seems to be, which is not the fact that, on one level you could say because they build that edifice, right, you say, well, it shows that they'll think you're not loyal to God, therefore you better follow it. That would be one idea, but the truth of the matter is it seems from the language of the Gemara and the Rambam that their conclusion, the reason you're following them is not because they're making a mistake, it's because somehow this edifice has some value. Their perception that this is what should be expected of such piety has some value, which implies that what they develop beyond the halacha from their own workings has some validity. But that's still based upon Torah. Now, the point is, though, is the definitions of Chilul Hashem, the Rambam brings down the actual definitions are talking about situations in front of other Jews. But the concept of Chilul Hashem is then taken to be involved with non-Jews. And once it's taken to be involved with non-Jews, you get to a very interesting question. In fact, that they're not building upon Torah. They're sort of saying, we expect Jews to act a certain way. Now, is it the case of cheeseburgers, and what you're saying in terms of cheeseburgers or carrying glasses on Shabbos? Because they expect you to act this way, because they think that this is the law for Jews, right? So therefore they say, hey, that person is not being an observant Jew because he violates the law, and therefore we don't want non-Jews to think that you violate the law. But the fact is, it doesn't seem it's just that way. It seems to be that if the non-Jew comes to some type of moral perspective, and the perception is that moral perspective has some kind of validity. Okay, if you look at my article, okay, there's an interesting. If you look at my article, now the fact is that it's how do non-Jews look at Jews? So if you see. In the first aspects of the article, I bring down the Sefer Mitzvot, and what I pointed out that is the perception that you're not following God's law. But there comes a certain point in time where Meforshim start developing a concept of Chilul Hashem, that it's not just you're not perceiving God's law, it's they're getting to some idea of a negative conclusion they're getting on their own. Okay? Let's look at. If you look at the in the middle page over here, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the middle page of my article. Okay. Okay. Let's look at the paragraph that begins in Mamar Kiddush Hashem. Okay. Okay.
Bottom left-hand corner.
Bottom left-hand corner. Okay.
Okay,
and he's building upon the third category I mentioned. Okay? Okay. But in Mamar Kiddush Hashem, the Rambam, though, this does seem to express the idea that Chilul Hashem also occurs when one creates a negative attitude towards Torah. In general terms, he states, when any person acts in a way that creates public ridicule and slander, this is a Chilul Hashem. In specific terms, when a pious or learned man acts in a discourteous manner, unbefitting his position, it is a Chilul Hashem. Okay, it would seem that there is support in the sources for the colloquial definition of Chilul Hashem, which is somehow you're not acting correctly, and people will see you as not acting correctly, that you're immoral. Okay, now this seems to imply that if you act in a way that the populace will ridicule it, it seems to say that the yardstick that the populace uses for evaluating ridicule is significant. Why should we care if the populace ridicules us? We care if the non-Jews ridicule us. Okay, if we act a certain way, In fact, in certain ways, some people say, and they bring it down from the fact of concepts by Chukim. There's a Rashi in Chukas that points out that non-Jews will actually laugh at you. I remember once on a video. This is, I guess, 20 years ago. They did a video down in Nathan Phillips Square asking people, "What do you know about Jews?" or "What is a Jew?" And I remember there were a bunch of young girls there, like late teens, early 20s, and they said, "Jews, they're people with their own meat stores, right? Like almost like, wow, they're weird people. They have their own meat stores." So the Rashi actually says that non-Jews will ridicule us for doing the chukim, for following certain laws. But in certain ways, if they ridicule us for certain things, it's unacceptable. Even if it's halachically permitted, we cannot allow ourselves to be ridiculed. So that's saying that the standard that's being applied for ridicule is in. Then he goes into another aspect over here. That says, if you look down to the paragraph Rashi in Yuma 86a actually introduces a third possible understanding of Chilul Hashem. He states that when Jews are punished for their sins, non-Jews see only the Jews, the nation of Hashem, are suffering. When they must declare that this misfortune must mean that God is unable to save the Jews, this is a Chilul Hashem. In other words, if we act in such a way that we give the impression that we're not worthy of God's saving, or then we say, "Oh, must be that God can't save it." This is a tremendous question by the Churban, by the way, by the destruction of the temples. That's what's pointed out is the Gemara talks about is God allowed the non-Jews to look upon him as being weak, right? Because he felt it was necessary to have the temples be destroyed, even though it would cause the non-Jews to feel that, hey, we defeated God. Okay, and therefore that's considered to be a Chilul Hashem. So in the destruction of the temples, by allowing non-Jews to become strong and to get the ability of thinking that they actually take over, they actually can defeat God, that's an aspect of Chilul Hashem as well. But it's trying to show that the conclusions that non-Jews reach from a certain perspective in their own yardstick can lead to the concept of Chilul Hashem. Okay? And then we find another definition of Chilul Hashem. Okay? And that's the definition that basically is from the Rambam and Hilchos Gzeil and Veda. The concept is like this. A Jew, okay, you have a mitzvah of a Shabbos Abeda, of returning a lost article to a fellow Jew. Right? Now, what about a non-Jew? Do you have an obligation to return a lost article to a non-Jew? So there's a whole variety of issues like this and so forth. But the fact is, the Rambam ends up and says, if it would be a Chilul Hashem for you not to return that lost article, then you should return the lost article. Okay? And this is what he gets into. Okay? Perhaps, okay, so why is it you're concerned whether if you keep it and don't return the lost article, why are you concerned about that? Halachically, you're only mandated to return it to a Jew. So I say perhaps the concern is that the non-Jew, believing the Jew must share the same moral conviction, after all, ethics are ethics, will see in the behavior of the Jew, even if correct according to Torah, a rejection of God. In other words, the non-Jew, the very concept that we're only supposed to be ethical to Jews and not ethical to, and we don't care about non-Jews. I've heard people say, "Hey, you only have to return a lost article to Jews, or you don't have to return it to non-Jews, or you only give charity to Jews, you don't have to give charity to non-Jews." The fact is, I've heard many people say this, that like, for example, the organization V'ahavta, which does humanitarian work. Not that this means that I'm totally saying that you should totally support this organization, but the fact that it went into Haiti and assisted there, the same way as the Israelis went to Haiti, people said that was a Kiddush Hashem. Because it says that the world looks upon it as ethical behavior. So it seems to say that there is a concept of ethical behavior in the world, and we have to show that we observe that ethical behavior as well, even if halachically it's not mandated. The problem is why is it not halachically mandated? The real question is okay, if it's really right for me to turn lost articles to non-Jews, or if it's really right for me to go into Haiti, why does halakha make the distinction between tzedakah for Jews and tzedakah for non-Jews? Because there is a halachic distinction. Why does it make that distinction? And why is that to be under the category of Chilul Hashem rather than just straightforward a mitzvah of returning the lost article? So the point is in some way the concept of Chilul Hashem seems to say we're going to give value to the world's perception of our behavior, but for some reason that's going to motivate us to have a certain behavior, but it's still going to be different than the halachic demand. We have a halachic conclusion, and then we say, because the world makes demands upon us, we will go beyond the halachic conclusion, because we don't want to machal l'shem shemaim, we don't want to profane God's name, that by not meeting the standard that is universal. So the question is, if there's a universal standard, why was it integrated right away into the halacha? Right? In other words, why create this twofold system? There's another concern. Does that mean also that you care about every moral perception in the world? Okay, and this was the issue, and you see over here in the article. And again, for the kosher 2 people, it's an article you'll find on the Nishma website, nishma.org. It's called "Defining Chilul Hashem." Okay, right? And the fact is that I mentioned for Ramosha, that Ramosha was challenged when he said, okay, for what do you call artificial insemination. One of the rabbis challenged him, and he said, what are you talking about? The Catholic Church says it's forbidden, and you're saying it's okay. We look less moral than the Catholic Church. And Ramosha basically said, since when do I care what the Catholic Church says? So the point is on one hand you're supposed to be concerned about the world, on the other hand Ramosha basically says, well, that doesn't mean you have to accept every ethical perception of the world. And there's also the further thing, other people think artificial insemination is actually ethical. So actually it leads to this idea that there are actually ethical issues out there where you have disagreements. So which one do we side on in those matters of disagreements? So this leads us to where we are right now, in the sense that there's this concept that says that we have to be concerned about our image to non-Jews and how they look at us. And the fact is they have an idea of what it is to be pious, what it means to be a righteous nation. And somehow that is supposed to be significant to us. The fact is, as we also pointed out for the mitzvah of Haftas Hashem, the mitzvah of loving God, the Rambam already pointed out that one of the things we have to do is we want to act a certain way in front of the nations of the world, so that they will like what we do and therefore love God, because God instructs us what to do. So somehow there's a yardstick out there in the world. The point is yardstick tells us to act in a certain way beyond the clear halachic definition. Well, if it's a value, why isn't it incorporated into the halacha? 2, the second issue is why is that every value that they have? What happens if they have values that are contrary to the halacha? Like nowadays, you have this whole issue with the rights, gay rights, and so forth and so forth. And we're obviously contrary to the general ethical value, but even there's arguments in the non-Jewish world. You have people for A and people for B, and where do we side on this? But the key point is is that it seems to be that God says there's a value in some ethical perception out in the world, and for some reason God did not want to include it directly in the halacha totally. Some ways it is. Saw that in terms of the Ramban and so forth and so forth. There was a concept of Kedoshim Tiyu and Asiti Yoshev and Tov, but we integrated it to a certain extent in halacha. But it is integrated, but it's not totally integrated into halacha. It's almost like a new structure upon the halacha. And the question is, why is that so? Which seems to give us an idea that the moral perceptions that we have, in other words, our natural morality and its relation to revelational morality, is not just integrated. There is something of a structure that's really interesting, and that's what we have to get to. Okay? That's where we're going from here. Okay? You understand? Okay, you follow me? Say that. That's why I'm looking at. What I really look at is the fact is, and you see it all the time in terms of Hashavas Aveda. See, Hashavas Aveda, the returning of a lost article, is a perfect example. The Gemara says you shouldn't return a lost article to a idolater, right? Sorry, to a non-Jew. Should not return it. So the Rambam points out that that this is according to the Rambam, okay, that it's only because they're idolaters. Okay, that's why we're not supposed to return it. But for a good, righteous non-Jew, you should return it. Okay? The reason you don't return it to an idolater, the classic example to try and bring that home, is if you found a suitcase full of money, and on the suitcase was a bunch of little swastikas, and you open up the suitcase and you find out that it's money belonging to Mr. White Supremacist, who's going to use that money for his causes, you can understand why you're not going to return the money. Right? So the idolater is considered, the reason you don't return to the idolater is that's strength in idolatry. But whereas if you're a righteous non-Jew, a Chassidic Umas Ha'olam, and so forth and so forth, the Rambam implies, you should return it. Okay, you should return it. And he obviously argues for Kiddush Hashem, you should return it, so forth and so forth. But why is it in the halacha? Why the halacha is Hashavas Aveda is only to a Jew? Why specifically only to a Jew? And then, why is it that because of other concerns, the moral perceptions, you do make it also part of the obligation to return to, ultimately not making that distinction between Jew and non-Jew. Okay, so that's really a tension. We have this idea there's a difference between Jew and non-Jew, and yet there's no difference, right? And really, that's part of the issue here. What's that distinction?
Also,
any
the
question? Yeah.
Of our understandings of the Zara, and that initially, anyways, there were no Gentiles who were not of the Zara. Right. So there was it was an artificial construct.
Right.
We now have non-Jews who are in this other category that are actually
But you also had Jews who were of the Avodah Zarah,
and
they had different status as well. In fact, the truth is that when you look at the matrix of identity, you have Jew, non-Jew, idolater, and non-idolater. The worst category was a Jewish idolater. Okay, the Jewish idolater, Morid and Vein Malin. You push them down and you don't help them up. What that means is, if you're standing beside the Grand Canyon with a Jewish idolater, and you happen to go, ugh, and the guy goes over, I'm sorry about that, right? Okay? Or if you hear a guy screaming from the well, right? Help me up there. Who is it? It's the Jewish idolater. Who? I don't hear anything. You know what I mean? That's what Malin Ben Marina means. That's what Marine and Vein Malin means. For a regular non-Jew, you don't have that law, and then there's also in that case there's also a question of Tinnik Nishma by a Jew who's an idolater, and there's a question of Tinnik Nishma and so forth. But the fact is that gets into a whole other thing. But the real issue is what I'm really getting to is that out there you have this natural morality. And the fact is, it doesn't integrate totally into halacha. And one of the reasons is Jew, non-Jew distinction, and the other reason seems to be that this natural morality is not so clear-cut. It's not so black and white. There's actually arguments over natural morality. Are you supposed to be on the pro-life side or the pro-abortion side? What seems to be that's it, but both people are arguing morally. Okay, euthanasia, not euthanasia. Well, people argue for euthanasia, so argue for morals. So how do you look at that? Okay? And that's where we have to go, in terms of morality and halacha.